It's a great honor for me to be here at the Empire Club of Canada today, which is arguably the most famous and historically relevant speakers podium to have ever existed in Canada. It has offered its podium to such international luminaries as Winston Churchill, Ronald Reagan, Audrey Hepburn, the Dalai Lama, Indira Gandhi, and closer to home, from Pierre Trudeau to Justin Trudeau. Literally generations of our great nation's leaders, alongside with those of the world's top international diplomats, heads of state, and business and thought leaders.
It is a real honor and a distinct privilege to be invited to speak to the Empire Club of Canada, which has been welcoming international diplomats, leaders in business and in science and in politics. When they stand at that podium, they speak not only to the entire country, but they can speak to the entire world.
Good afternoon, fellow directors, past presidents, members, and guests. Welcome to the 117th season of the Empire Club of Canada. My name is Mike Van Solen. I am a managing principal at Navigator Limited and the past president of the Empire Club of Canada. I am your host for today's virtual event on systemic racism, housing, and the realities of Black Canadians. To begin this afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge that we are broadcasting from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, and the Chippewas, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. For those who are tuning in from regions across the country, we encourage you to learn more about the traditional territory on which you work and live. In acknowledging traditional territories, I do so from a place of understanding the privilege my ancestors and I have had in this country since they first arrived here in the 1830s. As farmers in southwestern Ontario, I imagine they felt a deep connection to the land and yet likely did not recognize how that connection was built on the displacement of others. Delivering a land acknowledgement for me is an important opportunity to reflect on our human connection and responsibility to care for the land, and to recognize that to do so, we must also respect each other. I want to take a moment to recognize our sponsors who have generously supported the Empire Club and make these events possible. Our lead event sponsor today is the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board. Our supporting sponsors are Tridel, Kilmer Group, and Daniels Corporation. I also want to thank our seasoned sponsors, the Canadian Bankers Association and Waste Connections of Canada. And thanks to our event partner as well, VBC and livemeeting.ca, Canada's online event space for webcasting today's event. Before we begin today, I would like to mention that if you, at any point you feel your internet feed is slow, please see below and click the switch to switch streams. And as well, if you have any technical problems, there's a button and we're happy to help you. It is now my pleasure to call this virtual meeting to order. It's my honor to be returning for such a vital conversation as the one we are about to hear. It will come as no surprise to close observers that housing in this city breaks down along racial lines. It has long been established that income inequality was a defining factor of this city's geography. Those dividing lines also extend to race. Thanks to a growing awareness of systemic racism, there is a greater attention paid to the realities of race and home ownership. Joining us today on our panel is Mr. Moriga, the Vice President of Housing and Homeless Services at Wood Green. Mr. Moriga has more than 15 years of experience in the sector, both here and abroad, in countries including the UK, Australia, and South Africa. He played a central role in the redevelopments of neighborhoods including Regent Park, Donmount Court, and Lawrence Heights, and we are delighted to have him here to share his insights today. Joining him, we have Stephen Diamond, the CEO of Diamond Corp and the chair of Waterfront Toronto. In a past life, he was the head of McCarthy Tetro's Municipal Law and Planning Group, but since then, he has led Diamond Corp to design more than 15,000 residential units in and around Toronto. We are very grateful that Stephen is able to join us today. Rounding out the panel is Isaac Olowolafa, I hope I've said that right, an entrepreneur, investor, and philanthropist whose company Dream Maker Incorporated recently completed their first development, the Dream Residence at Yorkdale. He has been instrumental in the launch of the Black Tech Incubator out of the Ryerson DMZ, and in addition to his generous support of the university, he sits on the board of the Sick Kids Foundation. Here to interrogate this lot, for your edification, is Ian Underwood, the CEO of Habitat for Humanity GTA. After launching her consulting career at McKinsey, Ian spent the last 20 years in senior leadership positions at Canadian hospitals. At Habitat for Humanity GTA, she has continued to fight for a world where everyone has a safe and decent place to live. I'm thrilled that Ian is going to be able to guide our conversation today. Before I hand things over to Ian, I just want to remind everyone watching this panel that this is an interactive event. We encourage you to take advantage of the question box to the right of your screen and let us know what is on your mind and if you have any questions for our panelists. Ian will do her best to get to as many questions as she can. So without further ado, over to you, Ian.
Thanks so much, Mike, and thank you, Empire Club. We learned this morning that there's over 1,000 people who registered for this session today, which is, clearly a powerful indication of how much this matter of systemic racism is on our minds as Canadians. The term systemic racism or structural racism or institutional racism is a relatively new term for many of us. So before we go further, it's important to just consider, what does this concept mean? There's lots of definitions out there. For me, I like the way the National Post described this in June of last year, saying that the idea of systemic racism is not about individual attitudes. It's about how a society works. Good people can participate in systemic racism. First slide, please. Last week, the whole world got a reminder of what it takes to tackle tough issues like systemic racism. 22-year-old Amanda Gorman was speaking from the perspective of Americans when she so poignantly set the tone for America's next chapter under President Biden. But she could well have been speaking to us today as Canadians when she said, being Canadian is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. So let's take a few minutes to step back into our past as it relates to systemic racism and housing before turning to our panelists to get us all focused on what we can do together to build a better future. Next slide, please. So Mike opened by acknowledging our history with Indigenous people. And as he signaled, our very acknowledgement of the land on which we gather today is an acknowledgement of our history of colonialization and mass expropriation of Indigenous land and rights. Specific to housing, under the Indian Act of 1876, most aspects of which still remain in force today, Indigenous people had no right to own land and reserves. The Act included provisions such that the government has the authority over who lives on housing on reserve. Moreover, the Act denied the ability of reserve residents to leverage the equity of their homes to start a business, to make home improvements, or many of the other possibilities that are available to other Canadians. Next slide, moving to United Empire Loyalists. Many of us in school learned about United Empire Loyalists. We probably learned that some of them were Black, that they chose to fight for Britain in return to a promise of freedom and land. What we probably didn't learn is that when they arrived in Nova Scotia, they faced racism in all of its forms. Specific to housing, government policy instituted segregated housing. The housing tended to be on poor quality land. Over the decades, there was disproportionate placement of pollutants and toxins near Black communities, as well as those of the Mi'kmaq. Black citizens were required to pay taxes, but didn't receive the same quality of municipal services, including running water. And they were not given the full legal title to their land, such that today, many Black Nova Scotians are still working through decades-long legal processes to have full title to the land on which they and their ancestors have lived for generations. Next slide, please. Just switching over to Western Canada, beginning in 1942, the Canadian government expropriated the land and properties of more than 90% of Japanese Canadians and forced them into internment camps for the remainder of the war. But the discrimination was not limited to Japanese Canadians, nor was it limited to Second World War. There were clauses in Vancouver real estate deeds going back at least to the 1920s and found as late as 1965 that precluded the sale, the rent, the lease, the occupancy of a home to people of Asian descent, to Black individuals, or people who were of Indigenous heritage. And there are similar restrictive covenants that have been found in deeds in Calgary, in Sarnia, and in many other parts of Canada. So final slide, just how does that historical pattern then kind of show up today when we think of the experience and the housing realities of Black Canadians today? What you're looking at on the slide here is the location of where Black residents in Toronto live. And as Mike said at the outset, housing is highly racialized. Within the City of Toronto, the Black population is highly concentrated in the northeast and northwest quadrants of the city, a level of racial segregation that is on par with Minneapolis, where George Floyd lived and died, and which was ranked 40th out of 50 American cities on the degree of racial segregation. Thanks. You can bring down the slide, the PowerPoint presentation. So as Mike said at the outset, income is a major factor in determining the kind of housing you live in. And income, as we know, is also a factor of systemic racism. Here in Toronto, if you want to rent a family-sized 3-bedroom apartment, you would need an average income of $118,000. Contemplating owning a family-sized home, you have to have an income of at least $150,000. Now back to our Black residents in the city, the median income for Black men today is $47,000. For Black women, $42,000. So a Black man and woman, both working full-time and raising their family, would not combined have enough income to rent or own a satisfactory family-sized unit. So I think it's no surprise that the majority of Black residents in this city do not own their home. They live in rental accommodations, and typically those rental accommodations are crowded and unsatisfactory for their family size. A study last fall showed that Black and racialized renters in Toronto have a 3 times greater likelihood of living in crowded, unsuitable accommodations than white renters. So there's a lot to unpack here. And so now let's talk to our panel. For all of you on the panel, you are all members of the Black North Housing Committee. And so maybe kicking it off with you, Isaac, because you're the chair of the committee, talk to us about what caused you to get involved.
Thank you, Ian. For me personally, the reason why I decided to get involved is the fact that housing has a big impact on the sustainability of a family and a community. For any community to be sustainable, they need 3 things: institutional relationships like CMHC and the banks, growing small businesses, and access to homeownership. So in a time like this, to be involved with Black North allows me to amplify the work that I've been doing the last 10 years, which is trying to make changes, systemic changes within the housing system.
Marika, what about you? What caused you to say yes to?
I think through my introduction, it's clear that I've been working in the space of social housing for a long time. And at this point, actually just want to acknowledge the work that has been done by a lot of Black activists that I've been privileged to learn and work with in the last 20 years about this topic. So I don't want people to look at it as something that just started yesterday. This has been ongoing work for years. The George Floyd moment and the work of Black Lives Matter and the re-energization of the general population and awareness based on that experience, which was an open public lynching experience, clearly has re-energized a lot of us. And it has re-energized some of us as well around the Black North Initiative, building on the work of all the work that other people have done. And on a personal basis, I'd like to say that I own a home of my own in a fairly exclusively white neighborhood. So earlier, Ian, you've talked about systemic racism as not just necessarily targeting every individual. This is not an apartheid type of thing where every Black person is redlined in one zone, but it's also an illustration how difficult it is for most people to enter into that space of home ownership if I'm the only one in a neighborhood of 30, 40, 3,000 people or whatever. So for me, it has reinforced the necessity through my work as a manager in the Jane Finch area and in the Western area to ask myself, how come all these other people don't have the segue that is created in the system for most other non-Black communities?
Steve, let's round it out with you. What caused you to say yes to being part of the Black North Housing Committee looking at these issues?
Well, in my entire professional career, whether it's a lawyer or as a developer or as chair of Waterfront Toronto, I've been actively involved with the issues of community planning and housing. And a number of years ago, while I have participated in a number of committees and programs to address the issue, it was a number of years ago that I was involved in a program to find employment for disadvantaged youth called PAY, which was the Partnership to Advance Youth Employment. And it was at that time, for the first time in my life, that I had the opportunity to visit and work with youth that were mostly Black who were struggling in these outlying communities. And it was for the first time that I really understood the issue of systemic racism. It became readily apparent to me. In fact, you noted, and Marika spoke about it, I found that some of these youth were denied employment just based on the return address of which became returned. It was a real eye-opener for me. So I recognize that employment, education, and housing are the three most important pillars where new programs and ideas are necessary to create a more equal society. And the opportunity to use my expertise was a natural way for me to help. But I would just add one other point, that when we all get involved and work together to address these issues and to create and level the playing field, to help create equal opportunities for everyone, particularly in the housing field, the more prosperous and vibrant and healthy our overall society becomes. And that is in everybody's self-interest.
Thank you. And so I shared, some of the statistics we've been talking about as a committee at the outset. Maybe Isaac and Mariga, if you can bring those to life a bit more for us of just, we've got many, I'm sure, leaders and employers on the call today. What may they not be aware of or thinking about in terms of the lived experience of housing that their employees are leaving in the morning and going home to at night? And what's that meaning to their lives at work, to their lives outside of work? Mariga, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, and again, just I talked about my experience. I used to work in Jane and Finch, and I was fortunate at that point to live in Oakville. And the contrast of driving from one part of the city and then driving to another part of the city was always a disturbing phenomenon. I have to say also that I was a little disappointed that the statistics pointed out the city of Mississauga and Toronto. First of all, disappointing that Toronto would rank 40th in the US on the segregation scale. And secondly, that Minnesota is actually 40th in the US, because if you've been to Minnesota, it's actually one of my favorite cities to visit. It's also got one of the most progressive equity agendas of most US cities, but it finds itself at 40th because of systemic racism. And the issues that systemic racism does, Steve was very eloquent about those three pillars, and they rotate around marginalization related to income. It, in that sense, also connects to lack of opportunity. The interaction with education produce this impact where people are essentially deemed unqualified for the most part, and especially people from the Black community. And in that way, systemic racism has an inherent unconscious mechanism of feeding itself and feeding discrimination, because those individuals, once marginalized through those three critical pillars that Steve talked about, when they got put into the system, the mortgage and underwriting system, they always come out unqualified on the other side. And hence we have this growing segregation of our neighborhoods that most Canadians abhor. And I can say that with a lot of confidence because I go, but we don't seem to know how to fix it. And that's because it's systemic. And that's why we've put together this forum as BNI to try and get all these good people and all these highly qualified professionals to attack this problem, because it's not us.
Thanks. Isaac, do you want to pick it up from there?
Yeah, no, absolutely. To add to that, and my journey for the first half of my life in Canada, living in Jane and Finch when I was 4 or 5 years old and moving to Martin Grove and Albion, those stats were very blatant and right in front of me. And I was fortunate that my parents sacrificed to move us to Woodbridge for a better opportunity. And through that better opportunity, we were able to move away from those statistics. But as a result of now living in those statistics, and as a result of breaking a little bit of those barriers, homeownership allowed me to get higher education. Homeownership allowed me to start my business 15 years ago. And through that business has now gone into those communities that I first lived at Jane and Finch and Margrove and Albion, to provide financial literacy, to try and break down those areas that Steve mentioned, those systemic areas that are impacting the Black community. Because without access to housing, there's a ripple effect of access to employment, access to loans, access to leveraging it to be able to go to higher education, access to start a business. And by defining those access and bringing those barriers on those access of even starting a new business, it reduces employment within that community. So if not because of those privileges I had, I probably would be part of those statistics. And this is why the importance of Black North and the challenges that we're trying to change, and the model that we'll now discuss further in regards to how to make those changes.
Thanks. And just for our listeners, you're hearing a lot of reference to this term Black North. And so if you haven't heard the term Black North before, Black North is an initiative that was started through the corporate community back in June of last year, and now has 500 companies signed on to it. There are 16 committees working on 16 different dimensions of systemic racism. And the four of us actually on the phone, as you're hearing, are members of the Housing Committee leaning into this part. So as Mariga and Isaac have referred to, the committee this Black North Housing Committee has been putting a lot of attention to home ownership. So I think let's talk a little bit more about that. And even as I'm starting to see questions, understandably, there are questions about rental, about people on fixed incomes. The committee has been putting a lot of energy into how do we help more Black households become homeowners. Steve, how about you start by talking a little bit about why is the committee putting so much emphasis there?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to recognize that we're not suggesting that affordable rental housing isn't important. What we are suggesting is it's equally important to continue to develop efforts in the area of home ownership, an area that has been neglected. And let's just talk for a few minutes about why. First of all, if you look around, 68% of Canadians own their own home, and most of those are not from people within the Black community. And as the statistics have demonstrated, one of the most important ways of creating intergenerational wealth is through the gains made and the equity achieved by the opportunity to own a home. That equity that many of us use helps people, rather than just paying rent, to potentially invest in a business, further their kids' education, or help with their own retirement. How many of us listening today own a home and have had some help from their parents? At the current time, we don't think it's appropriate. opportunity should be denied to those people with less income. It just isn't fair or appropriate and continues the path that we've had, which leads to this issue of fighting systemic racism. I often in these committees hear about the supply and demand equations involving housing and access to housing. But in reality, to address the housing issues, we have to recognize fundamentally that it is an income issue and that an affordable home ownership program helps to address that issue. In Canada, earlier this week, I read a study showing that Canadians spend more of their incomes on homes than in fact people do in many other countries. Owning a home is part of our culture, and we can't just say to those that are working hard and can't afford a deposit that you can't participate in that portion of the market. We can't ignore the importance of working to creating and correcting this imbalance in the housing market. And it's not something that's absolutely new, because looking and preparing for this conference, I think Ian Yu has brought to my attention that after World War II, there were affordable housing programs developed by the government to get housing going. Unfortunately, the Black community wasn't able to participate to a great extent. And even a generation ago, people spent 4 times their income on housing, and today it's 15 times their income. You don't have to go far to find numerous studies that show that home ownership creates a sense of stability, community, and neighborhood that leads to improvements in other areas, not only housing, but social mobility and education, to just name 2. So what I'm hoping is that if we can get these programs off the ground, that the initiative that Black North has created will come to fruition and will be another important step in helping to level the playing field.
Steve, thank you. There's a lot there. And Isaac or Mariga, who wants to add to what Steve is saying? Mariga, over to you.
I was going to point to Isaac. Do you want to just go first on that?
Yeah, no, I think to add to what Steve was mentioning, and the key word Steve used was generational wealth. And when you think about housing is the first component of building infrastructure within a community. And when you specifically look at the Black community and look at infrastructure within the Black community, there's a lack of banquet halls, there's a lack of community centers, there's a lack of hotels, there's a lack of other forms of infrastructure that are needed for a community to thrive. Because the first focus is getting more increase of homeownership. Through that first increase of homeownership, then you're able to now start the ripple effect of building more infrastructure within the community and more sustainability within the community. And the model will talk about that.
Yeah, and thanks, Isaac. I mean, I think Isaac's story is a fantastic illustration of that. He mildly talked about having grown up in the Jane and Finch area. He now runs a company called Dream, and it's not called Dream by accident. It's about that journey that he wants to share and allow others to get through some of the things that he learned from his parents about what it takes to go out of poverty. We do sometimes mischaracterize the so-called dilemma between rental housing and affordable home ownership. Rental housing is the right of every Canadian, and we've accepted that that it's a human right that every Canadian should have access to housing, whether it's through home ownership, rental, or other forms of housing. And so it's a legitimate way of getting everybody access. Affordable home ownership is the way that people that are low income, people who are stuck in those neighborhoods that we just described that are not what we would like Toronto to be, get out of poverty and get out of that, because it addresses, to Steve's point, the 3 key elements of why people continue to be in that state, the issues of income, education, and employment that play out in that thing. And that's a whole conversation for another day. So affordable home ownership is an equity issue. And if I talked about earlier about the George Floyd moment being a calling point for all of us, COVID-19 moment is another one for us, because at the end of the pandemic, as you can see, it will create another economic divide between those who have wealth and can leverage their homes in order to recover from the pandemic, and those who don't have wealth currently. And what we are choosing to do as Black North is to use this moment to promote a whole group of people who are living in these communities that are part of the people who are our essential workers that have been working in seniors' homes and working in some of these highly impacted COVID homes to give them a pathway to generate wealth like everybody else.
Thank you, and and thank you to people who are sending in questions. I'm trying to keep up and watching them as we go. And I actually, to the panel, I want to put one to you that's kind of come up on the questions and in your comments. I think all three of you made reference to higher education. So there's a question here, in some respects paraphrasing of, okay, but if can't we just invest in higher education and create pathways to higher education, and won't that solve the housing thing as well, because it will get at income? So can one of you or more kind of talk about that? Can we not go at this just by focusing on education? Wouldn't that get us to the housing ends that you're talking about as a panel?
Again, to jump into that, I think that's one part of the solution, but the key is access to ownership. And if you look at the stats over the last 10 to 15 years, even in the GTA, and the increase of income compared to the increase of housing will show you the impact of homeownership. And then when you talk about generational wealth, that's a transfer of assets. So as much as importance there is in income and higher education, housing actually helps propel that as well too. And more importantly, housing creates the foundation of more opportunities and more creation of higher income within that general family and the community as a whole.
Thank you. And actually, it's in the introduction, you heard that I'm with Habitat for Humanity. Just for the viewers, the homes sitting behind me are Habitat for Humanity homes. Folks moved in there over the last couple of years. And actually, Isaac, on your point, I remember one of the mothers talking to me a couple of years ago about her three teenage daughters, who are now early 20s. And she was saying they could never, ever have been able to study to get the marks they did in high school and now be in post-secondary education if they were doing it in the I think they had been family of 5, 2-bedroom apartment. Like, it just wasn't possible to have the space to focus to succeed. Which I think is partly what you're getting at. These are intertwined, these issues of succeeding in education, work, housing, et cetera. There's a couple questions here about, okay, what can we do to help, and how can businesses be involved? How can corporations be involved? How do we get developers on this? So Isaac, maybe that's a good moment for you to talk about what has the committee come up with in terms of a program to address this and enable more Black households to become homeowners.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I've been fortunate to chair the Black North Housing Committee. And for the last 6 to 7 months, we've been working tirelessly to come up with a solution with the help of BCG as well, too. And the solution is a Black North Homeownership Bridge program, a program that has partnership and stakeholders of all levels of government involved, lending institutions, developers, and philanthropists. Our aim is at lower Black families' household ranging from $65,000 to about $90,000. The family will obtain a first mortgage from a conventional lending partner based on their income. The bridge between what the family can afford and the cost to actually deliver a home will be provided by grants of each level of government as well as donations. The difference between the market value of the home and the first mortgage will be held by the program as a second mortgage. We are then encouraging developers to be part of the solution by providing units to the program. And I'm happy to say Daniels, Diamond Corp, Kilmore Group, and Schreidel have all committed to being part of this program. Once the homeowner pays off the first mortgage, they start to pay down the second mortgage. At that time, once the sale happens, the second mortgage due goes back into the program with the shared market appreciation between both the program and the homeowner. This is where the program becomes more powerful and sustainable. Beyond just helping the first homeowner, the repayment back into the program creates a sustainable fund that would then be used to create homeownership bridge for more families in the future.
Thank you. Steve, Maria, anything to add?
Well, I was just going to say that, people should understand that the program is not intending to just give homes away to Black families or sell them below cost. What we're trying to do is enable families to use the income they have to get a mortgage that they can afford and get their family into a decent home that becomes a base for them to thrive. Then instead of using money they'd otherwise be paying for rent, they're building equity for themselves and their families. So meanwhile, we're creating more affordable housing units, but units that build wealth for families and generate taxes and other benefits for the larger community as well.
So just to bring this to life a bit, one of the questions is, okay, how do we help single Black mothers? So, walk me through, how this would work for, a single mom raising, a couple kids in her own and, working full-time somewhere and, having an income, but not an income that she can buy a home on her own.
Want to jump in or Marie?
Yeah, sure. Isaac, do you want to take that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So let's say the purchase price, for example, is roughly $500,000, and the individual was able to qualify for a mortgage of $250,000 or $300,000. So that'll be the first mortgage with a leading institution. And then the gap between the first mortgage and the purchase price, which we said was roughly $500,000, that is where all levels of government will come in, and also donors will come in to fill in that gap, to bridge it to the actual purchase price. So now that gap is filled in, and that individual is able to sustain that home based on her income. And as the property appreciates, not all the time, of course, but over a long period of time, as the property appreciates, once the property is sold, that individual gets a portion of that, but also the remaining goes back into the housing program so that it could be done again. There's other programs around overall support with the individual around financial literacy and other forms of support. But I think the key is that we're trying to point out is the focus on providing a mortgage that meets the needs of their income, the income initially, and then filling the gap with the bridge through different programs that are already existing, through CMHC and other different institutions, and then through donors as well.
Mariga?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, having worked in low-income communities and being part of the overall broad social policy, we have to remember that the biggest issue in low-income families is, in fact, savings, not being able to generate savings. We have a system, and a significant number of us have come to accept this, that disincentivize poor people from saving. We are asking that at this point, we have that donation in order to close that savings gap that low-income family people have, while at the same time, we advocate to the system to remove all these requirements that force people, before they take social assistance or other kinds of government benefits, from basically getting rid of their wealth before they can get access. If we have a system that begins to balance the assistance that people have with allowing them to keep their wealth, we will be able to close that gap that in this program we're trying to close at this point through the philanthropy. And it's actually a little bit of a venture philanthropy type of thing. You're investing in the fund through the individual, because as Isaac rightfully pointed out, at the end of the process of wanting to dispose the asset in order to move up into higher asset or higher housing because of the new equity created, some of that money will come back to the fund in order to help the next family. And that's the sustainability of it that is just a beauty in the kind of program that Black North Initiative has come up with.
I'm going to try to get a couple related questions that are in here. I'm going to go back to that single mom again. And I think, Mariga, you referred to this, is, okay, we've dealt with her income. You know, you said, and Isaac, I think what you're saying is, so we're taking her income, working with conventional lenders, but to get her a mortgage of what she can afford, right? If it's $200,000 or $175 or $250, whatever, then we stack the rest up. But the question is, but single mom she doesn't have money to set aside for a down payment, right? So have you thought, how's the program dealing with that? And you may already have covered it, but what about the barrier of the down payment to ownership, which is such a barrier for so many lower income households?
So again, there's different models out there, whether it's a first home buyer program, whether it's a shared mortgage with CMHC or through granting. I think that's where the program we're looking at, how do we supplement portion of the down payment, or the qualification of the home is all based on what the requirements they have as well. So if it's a $500,000 property and they only qualify, let's say, for $300,000, then if they're able to at least provide 2.5 to 5%, we are asking them for the banking institution to come on board, and then the bridge to fill in the gap.
Got it. Okay. And then one of the other questions that's come up is, how, because home ownership is it's associated with debt, right? And we know that we hear this term house poor, you know, so I think what you've said is the way the program works is that it's structured so that the amount that these homeowners are paying at the time they start being homeowners will relate to their household income. And then it'll keep relating to their household income over the period they own their home. Am I right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So the question, so someone has raised this question about, is there a risk here that we're just going to create a whole bunch of Black household indebtedness? And as Isaac has said, it's being built into the program to prevent that from happening, to having the payments continue to be calibrated based on that household income. Now, one of the other questions that has come up here is, someone's asking about, you know, part of this, and Isaac, you even referred to at the beginning, you said you grew up in one neighborhood and your parents made a choice and a number of sacrifices to move you to another neighborhood. But the question is, but are there things that we can do to, can we have it all? Can we work on transforming neighborhoods that are challenged today? And also get at some of what you're talking about with home ownership. So, and Mariga, I know you've talked a lot about this at the committee, is how do we think of neighborhood transformation? So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, and thanks very much for that. And if you imagine a community like Jane Finch and the concentration of low income working people, by the way, that live in that neighborhood, and enabling that community to be able to segue into home ownership, you can begin to see how that diversity of home ownership, rental housing, and the additional new types of businesses that come into that and create a whole different viability can actually regenerate a neighborhood and begin to close some of those gaps that we talked about earlier of having neighborhoods where we have concentration of Black, racialized communities as well, and other areas that, like the places I live in, which are basically a mono-white culture community. So part of that outcome through home ownership is to create that diversity and in its own way to create mobility so that as people take that journey towards wealth, they start to make choices to move into other neighborhoods. And we use the fund to bring in another new generation of people that will use that affordable homeownership model using existing already built up housing to start to go through that journey of wealth and out of that perpetual dependency on social assistance. Somebody talked about, are we not creating a community of Black people in debt? And I said, yes, you are. But I can tell you, I'd rather be a member of the Black community in debt and making the effort to pay off the debt through the income and increasing my, which history has proved is in fact what happens. And I was privileged to work in the region of Peel on a program like this, where we watched families transform themselves through that process. I'd rather be in that process than trapped in poverty.
Isaac, did you want to add anything on this one, or are you good?
Yeah, I think, speaking of communities, I think if we look at some of the examples of communities that has been redeveloped, where predominantly there was a higher percentage of Black families and individuals in those communities, like Regent Park, like Lawrence Heights, and if there was a program in place that attacked some of those challenges that we're talking about now, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, and look back at the prices of those specific locations, there would be a lot of wealth created within the community that was staying in those locations the 10 and 20 years prior to it being redeveloped. And I think those opportunities are still available and in areas like Western Road and Lawrence, Regent Park, Jane and Finch, as mentioned, and areas even across the GTA.
Great, thanks. A couple of questions have been about, okay, well, can you talk about a relevant success story? And someone else has asked, okay, but how is this different than Habitat? And, you know, maybe if I may, I'll just comment, because we talked about this at the committee. There are programs out there that are trying to help people to get into affordable ownership. Habitat is one, Options for Home is one. There's some other efforts that are out there. And I think it's fair to say to the panel, really what we've been trying to do here is draw on many of the features of those models, and this is a bit, you know, Habitat on steroids. Partly trying to get to a deeper level of affordability by having, really, Isaac, what you said, that pile on of getting all levels of governments engaged, philanthropists engaged, developers engaged, so that we can do much more. And Isaac, that leads to the other question someone's asked, is scale. Is this a Toronto thing? Is it an Ontario thing? Is it a provincial thing, or sorry, Canadian? And what's the goal? What targets has Black North set?
I think the goal is national, you know, and obviously, you know, being deliberate and focusing on the Black communities, but also looking at inclusiveness, obviously the First Nations, the Aboriginal communities, and other underrepresented communities when it comes to home ownership. And I'll add to the point that, like Ian mentioned, there's a lot of great programs that are out there, whether through Habitat. You know, Steve Diamond has mentioned some of the work he's done. I know Tridel's doing great work. Daniel's with the first home buyer work. And even the government has done great work in trying to drive affordability. The key here is everyone coming to the table and being deliberate in working together to come up with a solution to tackle a specific community that's been underrepresented when it comes to home ownership. And this is across Canada. So in areas, whether it be in Montreal, in Ottawa, and of course, in Nova Scotia. As you mentioned, some of the stats initially, Ian, on the impact of housing in Nova Scotia. So that's definitely an area where this program will work as well.
Steve, I'm going to put this one to you. Someone saying that it's sounding like housing that would be available through this program would still be, in quotations, less desirable neighborhoods, meaning farther from transit, farther from economic activity, opportunities, schools, hospitals. And so is Black North also looking at, you know, at integrating and trying to have this program in you know, communities that are more complete communities? So maybe
no, absolutely.
Talk about where will these homes be?
No, I think it's a good question. And I think one of the issues that was mentioned earlier on is we've been working with the private sector and development industry to try to make some of the units that we're building available for this initiative. And basically the development community, some of us have agreed that to give up the profit on some of these units in some very desirable locations to give the program a bit of a boost. And I think it's hopeful that through this initiative and the way that we work with our cities, one of the very important imperatives is that we increase social mobility and stop ghettoization so that people have the opportunity to live in all sorts of different neighborhoods. And the other issue that arose earlier on in the discussion is, and And part of that, in the end of the day, after this occurs, is that if people move back into some of the neighborhoods like Lawrence Heights or whatever, those areas will also start to become revitalized in themselves, creating a much finer form of housing. And so they won't be so much remaining in the state that they're in today, and will become more of a mixed community. So that overall, if this program can grow and be successful, not only will people be moving out of those communities, but the existing communities will become more mixed, both in income and ethnicity over time, which is so important.
And just to add there, I earlier talked about the fact that Minnesota and Toronto are some of the best places that I would want to live in, and there's a reason why, and that is it is not necessarily true that all the developments that we're proposing here will end up being in marginalized, out of everywhere, out of public transit. And we actually are very fortunate as a city, and this is why this is so tragic, because we have a fairly decent public transit system. We have an education system that is pretty much sensitive to being located close to neighborhoods, thanks to a system that wants to build a viable public system. So the basis, the grassroots, the foundation for that equity and making sure that people don't live in marginalized home ownership places is there. Jane Finch, for example, is by no means a place out there in the boonies. Jane Finch is probably going very soon to become served by public transit, and proximity to the airport, to York University, become one of the most desirable places to live. We just want to make sure that the people that live there benefit from that growth. That's really what the Toronto issue is. It's not about sending people out there. It's about making sure that lost opportunities do not lead to further marginalization. And Isaac gave an example of places like Regent Park as well. You could hardly describe that as being out there and marginalized. So our home...
Actually, Mary gets a great point, because just to add to that, Dick earlier mentioned Lawrence Heights. And I remember I was surprised when I went up there during my pay program, while sitting on the Allen subway line, and I met many youth that had never even been to downtown Toronto who lived there. I mean, it was astounding to me, but the transit line is right there. The importance of the initiative is we have to get those areas revitalized, and we have to get those providing home ownership opportunities as well as all other areas. And, it's an earlier interesting point about education that was raised earlier on. Many of the youth in these areas may not even want to get a high school education. It's not even a matter of money, but when they're surrounded by an ongoing generation after generation where they haven't seen the opportunity for intergenerational wealth to be created or to get equal access to employment, the initiative isn't there. And that's why home ownership, that the studies show, lead to a sense of community, leading to a greater sense of stability, leading to people getting jobs, leading to people wanting to get a higher education. And that's what's so important about this initiative.
And so great conversation. And I am sorry to wrap up, and I'm sorry to many people who have asked questions that we haven't been able to get to. But one of the themes in some of the questions are, how can I help? What can I do? Where are things at? What can I do? So let me just turn it over on the wrap up. But I think in particular, including, okay, people have been listening. How can they help? I'll be Mariga, Steve, Isaac. And we have to go fast.
Yeah, I'll start with the fund. Isaac articulated what it's for. This is an opportunity fund. It stacks your contribution with other incentives that other Canadians get for supporting home ownership, as well as other programs out there that are used to promote additional home ownership. And that's what it is. It's an opportunity fund that will be used in a sustainable way to support continuously other people and to be an example to all other marginalized communities about how we can break this cycle of poverty.
Steve.
Well, what I would say is, and when I started off by saying the more equal opportunities we can create, the healthier our society will be. So if it's something you support, let your governments know, your representatives at all levels of government, city, provincial, and federal, because we're going to need a lot of help in getting this program underway and getting their support for the initiative.
Isaac, you chair the committee. Wrap us up.
Yeah, no, again, I think it's been a great discussion, and thank you everyone for being part of it. But I think it's clear what the problem is, and what's even more clear is what the solution is and what the solution can be. And each person watching is sitting in a position or close to someone that's sitting in a position, whether in government, whether in the city, whether as a private sector or the lending institution that could help be part of the solution. And I'm very confident that this will be a generational impact and a benefit, an economic benefit to the city and to the province and to the country.
Mike, it's back to you. And I'll just let folks know, because many references have been made here. In the email that follows up to folks, there will be a link to the Black North initiative. So Mariga's talking about donating. Some of you have questions about getting involved. You can follow through that avenue. So Mike, back to you.
Well, thanks, Ian. The Empire Club in some ways has a simple mission, which is to have important conversations that really help Canadians and people around the world now understand important topics. And I can't think of a conversation that better fulfilled that mission than today's. So thanks, Ian, Stephen, Isaac, and Mr. Morega. I learned so much today. Let me introduce Lisa Patel, the president of the Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, to provide proper appreciation.
Thank you very much, Mike. Very insightful. So many things to take away: leading, opportunities to support, breaking cycles, solutions. And of course, thank you to the Empire Club. Thank you to our incredible speakers. I'm sure these discussions can continue for hours and hopefully more to come. But I will say Toronto Regional Real Estate Board, TREB, has had more than 100 years of real estate. And we're committed to strengthen equality and inclusion in ways to better serve and represent the various demographics that make up TREB. We foster and support a more collaborative, equal, and inclusive industry and work environment. TREB firmly believes that the GTA's diversity is one of the greatest strengths, and it requires us to collectively work together to preserve this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Thanks to TREB for being our lead event sponsor today. Thanks to the audience for tuning into this important conversation. I know it will be found on our website, so if you think there's others who should see it, soon you'll be able to find a link there and share it around. I'll tell you that on February 11th, we have Dr. Suresh Venkatesan, the CEO of Poet Technologies, joining us. There will be other events getting posted to our website soon. Please follow along, sign up for an email to get notice. We appreciate you joining. We appreciate being able to curate these conversations. Thanks so much, everyone. This meeting is now adjourned.